She called 911 on a black man for acting suspicious in his own driveway. But what he uncovered about her left the entire neighborhood speechless. It started as an ordinary afternoon for Karen Whitmore. She sat by her front window, just like she did every day, sipping iced tea, eyes flicking up from her phone every few minutes. Watching, noticing. She wasn't nosy, or at least that's what she told herself. She just liked to be aware. Who was coming and going? Who belonged? And who didn't? And then she saw him, a black man, gray SUV, pulling into the driveway of the Johnson place. At least that's what it used to be. The Johnsons had moved out 6 months ago, and as far as Karen knew, no one had bought the property. She leaned forward, pressing her lips together as she watched him step out of the car. No uniform, no clipboard, not a delivery guy. Just jeans, a navy sweater, and a calm, deliberate way of moving, like he had every right to be there. But Karen, she wasn't so sure. She squinted, watching, studying. He walked to the trunk, pulled out a couple of boxes and carried them to the front door. Karen's fingers hovered over her phone. Should I call someone? Maybe he was with the realtor, maybe a contractor. But there hadn't been a for sale sign in weeks. Then she noticed something else. He wasn't just dropping the boxes off. He pulled out a key, and slipped it into the lock. Then he stepped inside. Karen's pulse quickened. Her thumb hovered over her screen. Recent calls open number. This wasn't about race. This was about safety. What if he was squatting? What if he was breaking in? This neighborhood had always been peaceful, and she wasn't about to let things spiral out of control. She tapped the screen. 911. The line clicked. 911. What's your emergency? Karen exhaled sharply, eyes locked on the house. Yes, I'd like to report a suspicious person. A man just entered a vacant home on my street, and I don't think he's supposed to be there. The dispatcher's voice was calm, measured. Can you describe the individual? Karen hesitated. Just for a second. Black male, medium build. He parked a gray SUV in the driveway and used a key to go inside. A pause. So, he used a key? Yes, Karen said quickly. But the house has been empty for months. I don't know if he's supposed to have it. The dispatcher asked for her name, her location, a few more details. Then, we'll send an officer to check it out. Karen hung up, sat back, arms crossed. A strange mix of satisfaction and nerves. She wasn't accusing the man of anything. She was just making sure everything was in order. Because that's what a good neighbor does. And then, in the distance, sirens. A police cruiser rolled up, stopping behind the SUV. 2 officers stepped out, hands resting near their belts. Karen watched as the man emerged from the house, confused, brows furrowed, hands lifting, palms up, like he was trying to explain something. The officers gestured, first to his car, then to the house. Karen leaned in, heart pounding, because this was only the beginning. And then she saw something that made her stomach drop. The man reached into his back pocket, pulled out a set of papers, and held them up for the officers to see. One of them took the documents, glanced at them, and then nodded. The tension in their posture shifted, the stiffness in their stance gone. Within a minute, the officers had relaxed. The man gestured toward the door, and to Karen's shock, one of the officers even gave him a small nod before stepping back toward the cruiser. Karen's mouth went dry. Something was wrong. They weren't arresting him. They weren't even questioning him anymore. Instead, they were walking away, like it was nothing, like she had made a mistake. But Karen had no idea that this was only the beginning. She gripped her iced tea tightly, watching as the officers turned away, like the matter had been settled. Settled? How? She stood abruptly, pushed open her front door, and stepped onto her porch, pretending to check her mailbox. Close enough to hear, but not close enough to seem obvious. The man, this so-called trespasser, stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head as he looked toward the patrol car. Then, one of the officers did something that made Karen's blood boil. A pat on the man's shoulder. A casual, almost friendly gesture. Like this was all some misunderstanding. Karen couldn't take it anymore. She marched across her lawn, waving her hand. "Excuse me." One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a graying buzz cut, turned back. "Ma'am?" Karen forced a polite smile. "What's going on? I'm the one who called. I saw this man enter the house and I was concerned. The property's been vacant for months." The officer sighed, glancing at the man before looking back at her. "Ma'am, this is Mr. Ellington. He's the new owner of the house. He moved in today." Karen blinked. Her skin prickled. What? The man, standing just a few feet away, exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I live here." His voice was calm, but beneath it, there was something else. Controlled. Frustration. Karen's mouth opened, then shut. She looked between him and the officers, searching for something, anything that made sense. But there was no moving truck. No one in the neighborhood knew. Marcus let out a dry laugh. "Didn't realize I needed to run my plans by the neighborhood committee." The officer beside him shifted. Mr. Ellington provided his paperwork. Title, mortgage, driver's license. Everything checks out. There was no break-in, no suspicious activity. He narrowed his eyes slightly. Just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. Karen's face burned. She turned to Marcus, folding her arms. "I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. You have to understand." Marcus cut her off. "When I saw you pull in, you assumed I didn't belong." Karen's jaw tightened. "That's not what I said." Marcus held her gaze. "You didn't have to." Silence. Thick, heavy, uncomfortable. Karen could feel the officer watching them both, shifting slightly, maybe hoping she'd just walk away. But she couldn't. She turned back to the officer. "I didn't do anything wrong here." The officer exhaled through his nose. "Like I said, it was a misunderstanding. But going forward, if you ever have concerns, I'd suggest speaking to your neighbors before calling us. That wasn't advice. That was a warning." Karen took a step back, lips pressed together. She glanced at Marcus again, expecting to see smugness. But there was none. Just a look. A look she couldn't quite place. The officers nodded at Marcus before heading back to their cruiser. The moment those doors shut, the tension in the air grew even heavier. Karen turned, ready to retreat back to her house, back to safety. But then, Marcus spoke. His voice was quieter now. "Funny." Karen froze. "You saw me enter my own home, but you never noticed that I saw you first." Slowly, she turned back. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You've been watching me, haven't you?" Her throat went dry. What?" Marcus didn't look angry. Not exactly. He looked aware, like he'd figured something out. "I noticed you before today." His voice was calm, deliberate. "Watching, walking past, slowing down when you saw the lights were on." Karen's heart thudded against her ribs. This wasn't how this was supposed to go, and she had no idea just how much Marcus had already figured out. Karen barely slept that night. Her mind kept replaying it, over and over, the way Marcus had looked at her, the way his voice had dropped, just enough to unsettle her. Like he knew something she didn't. She kept telling herself it didn't matter. The police came. They checked everything. That was that. Nothing to worry about. But then why? Why couldn't she shake this feeling that she had just made a very big mistake? The next morning, Karen stood at her kitchen window, coffee in hand, peeking through the blinds. Her eyes flicked toward Marcus's house. She expected to see him leaving for work. Instead, there he was, leaning against his SUV and staring right at her. Karen jerked back so fast she nearly spilled her coffee. Had he been waiting for her to check? Her chest tightened. Maybe he was just trying to make her uncomfortable. Fine, let him try. If he thought he could intimidate her, he was wrong. But then, the worst possible thing happened. Marcus stepped off his driveway and walked straight toward her house. Karen's heart pounded. No time to think. Then, ding-dong! The doorbell rang. Karen froze. For a moment, she considered not answering, but she couldn't just hide. With a deep breath, she forced herself to move. She opened the door. Just a crack. Yes? Marcus stood there, his phone resting against his hip, a small, casual smirk on his face. Morning. His voice was too calm. Thought I'd return the favor. You seem real interested in watching me, so I figured I'd stop by and say hi. Karen kept her expression neutral. I don't know what you're talking about. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't friendly. See, I've got cameras. His voice was smooth, measured. Not just the doorbell kind. Full security system. Installed them before I even moved in. Karen's stomach twisted. Marcus lifted his phone, tapped the screen a few times. Then he turned it around. The footage played. Karen saw herself walking past his house multiple times, slowing down, staring at his driveway, coming back in the evenings, peering toward the windows. A chill crept up her spine. Marcus tilted his head. You called the cops on me. His voice was calm, but firm. But I've got days of footage of you lurking around my house before I even moved in. Karen's throat tightened. Her face burned. I was just taking my usual walk. Marcus let out a short breath, shaking his head. Right. His tone dripped with sarcasm, because most people take their usual walk, past the same house, at the same time, every single day. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but nothing came out. Marcus studied her, then pocketed his phone. See, I wasn't sure what your deal was at first. His voice was almost thoughtful now, but then I looked back through my footage. He took a slow step closer. I saw the way you kept watching the house, like you were waiting for something. Karen's heart pounded. That's ridiculous. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Maybe. Then his voice dropped, just enough to send a shiver down her spine. But see, I did a little digging. Karen felt her breath hitch. Marcus nodded slightly. This house sat empty for months, and yet somehow people around here already knew it was spoken for. Karen's lips parted, but Marcus continued. Funny thing is, I was the only one who put in an offer. His eyes locked onto hers. No one else, no counterbids, just me. The air between them grew thick. Marcus studied her reaction. Then his voice lowered again, and yet my realtor told me something interesting. He took one step closer. There was some neighborhood chatter. Karen swallowed hard. That some people expected someone else to move in. The silence between them stretched. Karen could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her. He wasn't guessing anymore. He knew. And if he had already figured this much out, what else did he know? Karen shut the door the moment Marcus turned to leave. Her hands were shaking. She stormed into the kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter. Deep breaths, in, outside. This isn't happening. He has nothing on me. He was just trying to scare her, that's all. But deep down, she knew better. Marcus had proof. Proof that she had been watching his house. Proof that she had called the cops on him for no reason. And worst of all, he had figured out the one thing that was never supposed to be spoken out loud. That house wasn't meant for him. Karen had heard the whispers. At the last HOA meeting, Judy, one of the board members, had been casually mentioning how they were keeping an eye on who was buying up homes in the neighborhood. Not in an aggressive way, of course, just a concerned, community-oriented way. And yet, when the Johnson house went up for sale, there had been an unspoken assumption that the next owners would fit the neighborhood's aesthetic. Then Marcus bought it, and just like that, everything shifted. Karen grabbed her phone, opening the neighborhood group chat. She hesitated. If she messaged now, tried to warn Judy or anyone, it would look too obvious. But she had to do something. Because Marcus, he wasn't letting this go. By the afternoon, the news had already spread. Karen heard it first from her neighbor, Linda. A quiet, hesitant knock on the door. Karen pulled it open, to find Linda standing there, phone clutched in her hand, like it had personally betrayed her. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you see this?" Karen frowned. "See what?" Linda hesitated. Then she turned her phone around. Karen's stomach dropped. A video. Marcus had posted it. Security footage. The clip showed her, walking past his house, over and over, peeking, slowing down, watching. The timestamps in the corner, undeniable. But then, the worst part, Marcus himself, speaking, his voice calm but sharp. "This is what I saw before I even moved in. And then, the moment I step onto my own property, cops show up. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't breaking in. I was just a black man moving into his own home." The screen went black. Karen's hands clenched at her sides. Her voice came out sharp. Where did he post this?" Linda's voice was almost shaky. "Facebook, Instagram, and the neighborhood group." Karen felt cold. Linda looked at her, brows furrowed. "Karen, what is this?" Karen exhaled sharply. "It's taken out of context." Linda gave her a look that said she wasn't buying it. Karen's chest tightened. "I was looking out for the neighborhood. I saw someone suspicious. I had a right to call the police." Linda's lips pressed together. "But he wasn't suspicious. He was just moving in." Karen swallowed hard. "So now I'm the bad guy?" Linda didn't answer right away. She glanced down at her phone, then back at Karen. "People are talking." Karen stiffened. Linda hesitated. "Judy already commented. She's trying to do damage control, but..." She shook her head. "This isn't going away." Karen's face burned, because Marcus had done exactly what she was afraid of. He had exposed everything. Not just what she did, but why she did it. And now, everyone knew. For the next 2 days, Karen barely left her house. She had never felt this kind of humiliation before. Not when her youngest son dropped out of college. Not when her husband left her for a woman 20 years younger. Not when the HOA fined her for leaving her Christmas decorations up until February. This was different. Because this wasn't just about her reputation. It was about how people saw her. And now, they saw her differently. The first sign? At the grocery store. She went early, hoping to avoid most of the neighborhood crowd. But even in the quiet aisles, she could feel it. The eyes on her. The stolen glances. the quick whispers. She turned a corner and nearly ran into Bethany Moore, 3 streets over. Bethany's face tensed, but she forced a polite smile. "Oh, hey, Karen." Karen's grip tightened on her cart. "Hey." She waited for Bethany to say something else, to start a conversation like she always did. But after a brief, awkward pause, Bethany nodded and walked away. Karen's jaw tightened. The next sign? The neighborhood group chat. She hadn't been officially removed, but the silence was loud. No replies, no likes on her posts. Conversations continued, as if she wasn't even there. And then the HOA meeting. Karen almost didn't go. But skipping it, that would look like guilt. So she sat, in her usual seat, back straight, hands folded, face neutral. Judy stood at the podium, rattling off neighborhood updates, and then open floor discussion. A chair scraped against the floor. Karen felt it before she saw it. Marcus, standing up, her stomach dropped. His voice, calm, even, collected. "Since I'm new here, I just want to make sure I understand how things work." Silence. Karen could feel it, the tension in the room, because they all knew. This wasn't just a question, this was a reckoning. And Karen, she wasn't ready for it, not at all. Judy smiled, tightly. "Of course, we're all about keeping communication open." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Good to know." His voice was calm, but his eyes, they were sharp. "Because I was curious, how does the HOA handle situations where a homeowner is harassed by their neighbors before they even move in?" The room fell silent. Karen's nails dug into her palm. Judy's smile twitched. I'm not sure what you mean." Marcus nodded. Then he pulled out his phone. "I think you do." A single tap. And suddenly, the video was playing, right there, for everyone to see. Karen's heart pounded. The whispers started. Someone coughed. A few people shifted uncomfortably. On screen, the footage. Karen, walking past his house. Again and again, watching, lurking. And then, Marcus's voice. "This is what I saw before I even moved in. And then, the moment I step onto my own property, cops show up. I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't breaking in. I was just a black man, moving into his own home." The screen went dark. Marcus put his phone away. "So, what's the policy on that?" Judy cleared her throat, glanced at Karen. I think we should take this discussion offline." Marcus smiled. "Oh, I'm good having it here." His voice was light, casual. "Unless, of course, it's an uncomfortable topic." More whispers. A few murmured agreements. Karen's face burned because she realized something. Marcus hadn't come here just to expose her. He had come here to make sure they all saw themselves, too, because she wasn't the only one who had wanted him out. And now, no one wanted to be the one standing next to her. She could feel it. The slow, quiet way people were stepping back, distancing themselves. And for the first time in her life, Karen was the one who didn't belong. But the worst was still to come. Karen had always believed that people like her didn't get punished. Maybe some gossip, a few awkward encounters, but nothing serious, nothing lasting. She had spent years building her place in this community, fundraisers, HOA meetings, a perfectly manicured lawn. She belonged here, or at least, she used to. The real consequences came a week later. It started with a phone call from her son, Andrew. His voice was tight. "Mom, what the hell did you do?" Karen sat up straight. "What are you talking about?" Andrew sighed sharply. "I got a call from a colleague today. A colleague, someone I work with. He saw your video." Karen's stomach twisted. That was taken out of context. Andrew let out a humorless laugh. Context? Mom, you called the cops on a guy for moving into his own house. And now, it's everywhere. People are talking about it at my office. My boss saw it. Karen's chest tightened. I didn't mean... Andrew cut her off. You didn't mean for it to blow up. But you meant every part of what you did. Karen opened her mouth to argue. But Andrew wasn't done. You know what's funny? I never saw you as that kind of person. Controlling? Sure. Stubborn? Absolutely. But now I have to sit in a break room and listen to people talk about my mother like she's some racist caricature. So, thanks for that, Mom. Just don't call me for a while, okay? The line went dead. Karen stared at the phone in her hand, an empty, sinking feeling in her chest. For the first time, she felt something close to shame. By the time the HOA meeting minutes were released, her name was gone. No mentions, no invitations. It wasn't an official removal, but it didn't need to be. She was being phased out. Neighbors who once waved now looked past her. Conversations she used to be a part of now happened without her. And then, the final hit, her property value. Karen had spent years protecting this neighborhood, making sure homes were only sold to people who fit. Now, Marcus had started a community outreach initiative. The local media picked up his story, framing him as a symbol of resilience. People outside the neighborhood, they started watching, asking questions, digging into the HOA's past. Suddenly, the community that prided itself on prestige was under scrutiny, and suddenly, houses weren't selling as fast. Karen had fought to keep things the same, but all she had done was make sure everything changed. One evening, she sat alone in her front yard, staring at the house she had tried so hard to keep vacant. Marcus was outside, laughing, carrying groceries with his sister. He glanced toward Karen's house for a second. Their eyes met. He didn't smirk. He didn't gloat. He just gave her a single, slow nod, not out of kindness, but acknowledgement. Karen looked away first. She had lost, and deep down, she knew she had deserved to. Prejudice isn't always loud. Sometimes it hides behind concern, behind tradition, behind what's best for the neighborhood. But the truth always comes out. And sometimes the person who gets exposed isn't the one you expected. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, like, share, subscribe. Let's keep these conversations going.